Looks like we are all set. Good evening, everybody. If you're in Flagstaff, I hope you are inside and warm and that you didn't put your back out shoveling your driveway. My husband and I determined that we are no longer in our 20s as we shoveled our driveway this morning, so that was super fun. For those of you who have not joined us for a webinar before, my name is Megan Remington. I'm our Community Education Coordinator here at Coconino Community College. And I'm really excited about tonight's presentation. I had an awesome opportunity to see Kara present as a part of my Flag Leadership Program cohort, where we talked about the beauty of the diversity of our fabulous city here in Coconino County. And so I got Kara to give us some of her time tonight to share more about the Lived Black Experience project that is taking place here in Flagstaff. And if you've lived in Flagstaff for very long, you're familiar with the beautiful history of the Southside neighborhood. And so Kara's here tonight to talk to us about the project and how what their committee is doing is enabling our city to be even better than ever. So Kara, I'm going to go ahead and disappear. For those of you, if you have questions along the way, I recommend putting it in the Q&A function. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat so that Kara knows if a question pops up, the Q&A is the best way to go about it, so it doesn't get buried in comments and things like that. So with that, Kara, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joining. I've seen the folks that have come in, including a special guest for myself. My dad is here with us tonight. And it's just a pleasure to be able to share and speak with you all about the Live Black Experience project, what we've done, why we did it, and what work we're continuing into the future, as well as how it applies to the idea of community development and neighborhood and ensuring visibility and engaging in advocacy. What do all of those things mean together, and how do they relate to the Live Black Experience? I'll also share with you all that we just had a mind-blowing revelation at the beginning of this session that we're now able to share a PowerPoint directly in here, so I can see any comments that you're putting in the chat as I'm going. Feel free to ask questions as I'm going along, and I'll see if there are any that I can answer in the midst of the presentation. So before we get started, just by way of introduction, my name is Kara House. I am the secretary for the Live Black Experience Project Steering Committee. I was part of the Live Black Experience Community Coalition that started this project going, that engaged in some of the initial conversations that led to the strategic plan. I'm a co-host and co-facilitator for the Live Black Experience Community Dialogue series. I am the chair for the Coconino County African Diaspora Advisory Council, and I'm a proud graduate of Northern Arizona University, class of 2011, with my master's degree in English. Before we get started, I want to begin with the land and community acknowledgement that we often present as part of this work with the Live Black Experience. This is a combined acknowledgement that recognizes the shared community of Indigenous communities that call this area home. And the experience of those in the Southside who have called that place home and contributed to the development of Flagstaff. So we recognize that this place we call home sits at the base of the sacred peaks on homeland shepherded by more than 12 tribal nations and Indigenous peoples throughout this region. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their past, current, and future generations who will forever call this place home. We recognize that this dream we carry of beloved community rests on the shoulders of Black women and men who populated the historic Southside community of Flagstaff, who worked the lumber yards and various industries through which Flagstaff historically thrived, and who continue to toil for recognition, memory, and unity. We recognize and acknowledge that the very foundation of the United States of America was built on the free and forced labor of Black and Indigenous peoples. This foundation has generational and exponential effects that continue to negatively impact these communities today and remain uncompensated. The historical and contemporary contributions of these communities continue to shape American culture and benefit all inhabitants of this land. So let's dive in. Let's talk about where the story of the Live Black experience really begins. On Juneteenth, 2020, so June 19th, we saw several organizations in our community come together for the commemoration of Juneteenth in the midst of COVID-19. With that celebration, we shared a presentation that combined some of the past Juneteenth celebrations based out of the historic Murdoch Center. We shared stories of people who grew up in this historic Southside, who saw their families shaping this community into the community that it is now. And with that sharing, we had immediate feedback from audience members who were able to participate, who simply came back and said, we want to hear more. We didn't know this story. We didn't know where Juneteenth came from. We didn't know these stories of the South Side, and we just want to know more. So that really is the launching point of the community lectures that we started to do about the Live Black experience. In the midst of this, there was also the murder of George Floyd. And with his murder, that sparked several local conversations on what it meant to live as a Black person in all communities of this nation. What we started to see, though, was very interesting conversations that were started specific to Flagstaff, where there were different groups that were either coming out of or coming into our community and starting to speak on behalf of the Black community. Making demands of city council or going to other groups and calling them out or calling them to action in ways that did not necessarily take into consideration the actual lived experience of the Black community members who called Flagstaff home. Part of what happened with that conversation was there was a session that was hosted by former Mayor Coral Evans at the Murdoch Center that brought together members of all of those different groups, sat us down and had a conversation about what does it mean to engage in true civil discourse? What does it mean to speak on behalf of community? And should we not, in the midst of doing that, actually take time to understand the people that we're speaking for and the story that we're speaking into? With that conversation, that really was, again, the launching point for some of the ongoing conversations that we started having about the Live Black experience in Flagstaff, which very quickly broadened into further conversations with the Live Black experience throughout Arizona and the Live Black experience throughout these United States. In the midst of that work, so as we are celebrating Juneteenth, engaging in these conversations, mourning the death of George Floyd and the civil unrest that sparked across the nation, grappling with what it meant to be Black on the mountain, and so many other important conversations that we were having, we had outreach with Flagstaff City Council. We told them that there is an unheard story that was really pushing to come forward from the heart of Flagstaff. There were people who felt invisible, people who felt that their stories were not being heard or being told in the way that they really wanted them to be told. So we proposed to City Council that we, as the Live Black Community Coalition, partner with them to host a series of community town halls in which we would ask the question, what is it to be Black in Flagstaff? What does that mean? What is it like to live here? What was it like to live here for those who had historical ties to the community? What's changed? Is it comfortable to be here? And if not, what makes it uncomfortable? And several other questions about what does change look like? What is the change that you would want to see in this community? What are traditions that you want to see upheld or recognized? What's the history that we are failing to recognize when it comes to the story of Black lumberjacks, of the Black nurses and flight attendants, and so many other professionals whose stories simply were not being told as part of the ongoing story of Flagstaff. And through that work, we compiled all of that information together, put it into what was called the Live Black Experience Strategic Plan, presented that to the city of Flagstaff, and it was adopted in December of that year.
Kara, quick
Yes.
question. Would you mind, your reference at the very beginning of Juneteenth, I will point out that some of us, myself included, very embarrassingly didn't know what Juneteenth was until very recently. Would you mind giving a brief description of what Juneteenth represents and where it came from?
Absolutely. So Juneteenth is the celebration of an executive order that was issued after the Emancipation Proclamation in Galveston, Texas. It was the last group, at least knowingly at the time, of unliberated enslaved Africans. They were the last to hear that emancipation had happened 3 or 4 years earlier than they were hearing this executive order. It's actually a very fascinating history of that celebration. The first celebration of Juneteenth was really just the reading of that proclamation. And as word started to spread, the Black community of Galveston, realizing that they were free, began celebrating it. At the time, it was not actually a very broad celebration, as you would probably imagine that it wouldn't be, right? As people are just coming to terms with, well, what does this even mean? Are we actually free? What are we supposed to do now? What does this mean for us? It was a question that they had to grapple with at that time. But over time, it developed into an annual celebration of emancipation and freedom for that at least last group of the Confederacy who learned that they were free. We all know, or most of us know by now, or at this point in our lives, that the Emancipation Proclamation was a very complicated document. If you read it closely, it actually only provided freedom to slaves who were part of Confederate states. So it did not liberate any states enslaved people who were part of the Union. There were other territories in which enslaved persons were still considered bound, as they were somewhat used as, I hate to say it, but leverage in the Civil War effort. But Juneteenth has now come to represent that celebration of freedom and a celebration of Black culture for our nation. And it was actually just recently adopted as a national federal holiday. And so we're excited to celebrate it going into this year. So thanks for that question. And if you want more information on Juneteenth, I would certainly encourage you to go and look at the Live Black Experience YouTube channel and the Live Black Experience Community Dialogue Project page on Facebook, where we house all of the past conversations that we've had, including several that are specifically talking about the history of Juneteenth and what it means. So when we talk about the Live Black Experience strategic plan, there were several different parts of putting that strategic plan together. First, we held several community forums, or town halls, as we called them at the time, that focused on the 6 different areas that you see on your screen now. In the midst of doing those community forums, we also hosted various focus groups within the community to try and get as many different people as possible the opportunity to speak into what they knew about the Live Black experience in Flagstaff and what they wanted to learn about it. Certainly those who were coming into this conversation were not only members of the Black community. We had members spanning all different demographics and age groups that were speaking into it and simply saying, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and this is what we want to know as we had those conversations. We had different forms of educational outreach, including those ongoing community forums that were happening on Facebook Live. We reached out by email. We had small groups with different organizations around town and just gathered as many pieces of information as we could about that experience. And there were three primary things that we heard coming from that conversation. The first thing was a call out from the community, tell us more. It was that urging to make visible what was invisible in Flagstaff, whether it was the story of the Black community in Flagstaff, or simply the different experiential things that were contributing to that story that people simply weren't aware of. We heard a call for there to be increased cultural representation and celebration, and started asking the question of, A, why has that not happened within Flagstaff? And B, what would it take to make that happen more or more visibly within our community? And finally, we heard various calls for different area specific changes. And by that, we just mean whether it was going into city governance, into organizations or employment practices, into neighborhood development, all of these different areas that we started to see, there are definitely things that we can work on across all of the 6 focal areas that we talked about in those community forums, and even broader into the landscape and the story of Flagstaff. One of the stories that I frequently share when talking about the Live Black Experience project, and that I say I will always share and repeat this story because it stuck with me. When I say it haunts me, I truly mean it because of how impactful it was. And it's what I call the story of the invisible child. During one of the sessions, we were focusing specifically on youth issues and concerns. And we made sure that we reached out to the schools to encourage actual young members of the community to come and speak and tell us, what is your experience in your community and specifically within your schools? And one young woman, as we were asking, what her experience was, just shared the story that one year she had asked in her school why they weren't learning about Black History Month. And her teacher's response to her was that there are too few of you for that to matter. And it was just that thought that a young person, a child, would be told in an environment of learning where they were supposed to be learning about the history of this country, learning where they fit into the story of their nation, learning where they fit into society as a whole. They were told their story didn't matter. That was something for me that told me this work was more important than we maybe even realized at the time that we were starting to do it. It told me that there was a deeper story and deeper impact that we could have by engaging with people like her who had been told that their stories did not matter because there were too few of them for the larger community to care about. That's certainly something that we have pushed back against through the Live Black Experience project, and that we continue to push for the city to recognize is not an answer that should be given to any member of our community. So what were the outcomes? This is where we start getting into what it means to engage in this sort of work. What did we learn from doing the Live Black Experience project, and what are we continuing to learn? But also, how can you, as folks who are watching and participating in this conversation, contribute to this work, no matter where you are? So the very first thing that we heard back from people was that call to make visible the invisible. And that raises some very important questions, namely, what is community visibility? What does it mean to be considered visible or invisible within your community? Why is that important? What does it look like? And how do we ensure that community visibility exists? So to give you some basic definitions, community visibility is simply having presence in, belonging to, and having autonomous voice within your community. It means that you are seen, you're recognized, and you're valued within the community. It means that there's a sense of belonging, that you not only see who you are and you see who the community is, but you see how those two things come together and how they work together to let you know, I exist, this community exists, we exist together, and we belong together. It's the recognition of both collective and unique stories within community. It pairs the capacity to tell your own story with the ability to be part of the collective story of the place that you're choosing to call home. And why is that important? It's important simply because ensuring that community visibility ensures that personal accountability and commitment to your community exists. It means that you feel not only that you belong to your community, but you also have a stake in that community. You're invested in that community. What does it look like? Well, it looks like several different things. For the city of Flagstaff, we've seen that that looks like land acknowledgement, which the city of Flagstaff just recently adopted their own land acknowledgement statement that is now shared at the beginning of city council meetings. It's saying that we acknowledge where we are. We acknowledge who this land is home to, who it is sacred to, where it came from, and that we are blessed to be on this land, but it's also a very complicated reality to exist on a place that was in many ways taken away from other people for the advancement of other groups, and that has not always treated any of the different groups that inhabit it equitably. It looks like historical and heritage recognition, simply recognizing that all of those histories are intersecting through the community and are part of that broader community story. It acknowledges the relevance of each person and each community within neighborhood, within community, within the entirety of the city or the state or wherever we're talking about. Community visibility is simply the first step in a journey. It's simply the beginning to acknowledge that these other voices, these other people, these other parts of our community exist. And why is that important? Well, I think the answer is in the question. Is it important for each person who's watching this now to feel like you belong in whatever community you're identifying as part of? And I think arguably the answer is always yes. I want to feel that this is my home, that this is a place that accepts me for who I am, because I'm choosing to be here and to be part of the story that's being told. So how do we ensure community visibility? Well, the answer is simply you do the work. You begin by engaging in that act of recognition. You start then moving on to the next phases, which are representation, preservation, and acting as an ally or an accomplice, and beyond. And we'll get into all of those things as we go further into this presentation. The next thing that was called for was cultural representation and preservation. And again, that leads to several questions. What is cultural representation? Why is it important? Where can we work to ensure that cultural representation and preservation are actually being engaged in our community? And how do we fight for those things. I saw a question that just popped up in the chat. And the question was, when was the first time the Black community was acknowledged in Flagstaff by the city? I think that's a complicated question. I think it's a great question, but it's a hard one to answer because there have been different groups and different stories that have been told of the Black community within Flagstaff, none as fully or as holistically engaged as the work of the Live Black Experience Project. But we've had the NAACP of Flagstaff. We've had recreational centers that were part of and very central to different parts of the Black community. And those are moments where you start to see the complicated history of Flagstaff when it comes to engaging the Black community. You had cultural centers that were very important to one part of the Black community that was essentially taken away or repurposed for other groups. And it created senses of almost animosity between different parts of that community who were being told what was sacred to you is no longer sacred to us because we're recognizing this other place as sacred. This is your space. This is where you belong in the community. It's very, very complicated. And it's something that I think as we continue to acknowledge those shifts and changes within our community, we just continue to have a better and a broader understanding of what it means to be part of this community holistically. So what is cultural representation? Cultural representation is to be intentionally reflected within the verbal, the artistic, and the physical space of a community and its culture. This is that next step beyond simply being visible. Now we're talking about actually being included, actually seeing yourself reflected within your community and fully being part of the community that you call home. Preservation is the act of having spaces that are actually reflective of your cultural identity, that are maintained and that are valued within a broader cultural community space. So collectively, cultural representation and preservation are the valuing of visible identity within space with intentional dedication to maintaining that visibility in ways that beyond mere acknowledgement, which is again, very important, but it takes it beyond acknowledgement to actual celebration and honoring of the collective and the unique identities that exist within a community as one full story of what that community is. This is moving beyond site recognition into value recognition. It goes beyond saying, I see you and I recognize that you're here in this community, to saying, I see you and I value what you are in this community. Visibility is the first step in this process. Representation and preservation then take that next step to bridge that gap between feeling that you are a part from the community. You might be seen, but you're not necessarily valued. And being a part of the community, to being seen, being valued, and being truly included within the community that you call home. Cultural representation and preservation are establishing or working to establish cultural preservation sites, whether it's community centers, cultural centers, landmarks. It's celebrating culturally inclusive events like Juneteenth. It's recognizing historic locations like the historic Murdoch Center. It's recognizing that all of those places, those spaces are telling the broader story of the community. Where we start fighting for this then, when we ask the question of how do you fight for cultural representation and preservation? Well, you fight for it by coming from that place of advocacy, by engaging in allyship and accompliceship, by seeking specific cultural changes within the community, which of course takes us right into that next ask from the strategic plan, which was for those specific changes within our community. So the questions here are, what does change look like for a community? How do we advocate for different community members or different community identities? What does it mean to be an ally? And who gets to be part of this process of seeking change, of giving voice, and so forth within the community. So the first thing that's really essential to understand here is that being a part of community, having accountability within that community, means that you are actually engaging in the work of culture change and cultural adaptation. Culture change is recognizing that if these things have not existed within the community before, the community needs to change to a place that these things can exist, where we are acknowledging different groups. Cultural adaptation is saying, we're not going to throw everything out the window. We certainly have history, but how can we adapt that to the different communities that we're serving, to the different folks who are coming forward and saying, I belong here and I want to be valued within this community. So collectively, these works are the act of recognizing that inclusion and recognition within community often means shifting our understanding of how community and cultural identity are defined within that space. We engage in this work by engaging in things like advocacy, allyship, and accomplishment. And in case you're wondering what those things mean and how they're different, we're going to talk about that right now. So advocacy is public support. It's providing a recommendation, and it's providing defense for a cause or a policy and so forth, typically with a call to action on behalf of that cause. Allyship takes it a little bit deeper, and it gets a little bit more personal. Allyship is the act of partnering in providing voice and standing alongside those whose voices are often minimalized or ignored within a community. And it's uniting to promote common interest. And one of the key phrases here, and the main thing to remember, is that allyship is earned. So often now it's kind of a buzzword to call ourselves, I'm an ally to this community or to this identity group. But we don't get to call ourselves allies. Those groups get to call us allies. They say, I want you to come alongside me. I appreciate your help. It's not speaking on behalf of other groups. It's speaking along with those other groups, with their permission to ally and advocate alongside them and with them, not standing in front of them, not standing behind them and hoping that everything turns out okay. It's actually engaging with them on a very personalized level, making sure that you have that permission to speak on behalf of, but not speak for those different groups. And then accomplice, or the act of being an accomplice, is actually being willing to put your privilege at risk to disrupt and create space for meaningful change. It means that I'm not just going to stand beside you, I am going to step in front of you when there's something at risk. I'm going to be willing to set aside my personal prerogatives, my personal plans, and my personal privilege to advance what other people in my community need. It's saying that my voice is no longer just for me. I don't care what this costs me. The cause that I am fighting for is so important that I am willing to give up that point of privilege to help somebody else achieve something wonderful and to create beautiful community for all of us. So where do each of you who are joining tonight fit into this work and fit into this story? This is the point where you all are invited to engage with programs like the Live Black Experience Project, to actually recognize that you are part of the ongoing story that's being told, and that you have work to do. You have work to do to seek out the stories of the groups that you don't know, that you aren't familiar with, who you live in proximity to, but not in relationship with. It's not only asking questions, but it's being willing to listen when someone is actually willing to share that story with you. And it's being willing to be humble in that sharing, to believe someone when they're telling you that there is something that they need, or there's something that's lacking in their experience, and to seek out ways to advance that for them and with them. what can you do as part of this work? This is really where we see the lesson of the Live Black Experience project. In that work, we recognize that there was a need for a particular community to be able to tell its own story. Again, going back to that civic engagement session that we had with Mayor and now Dr. Coral Evans, during that session, she talked very specifically about the fact that at that time, there were people coming into Flagstaff who were telling our story as the Black community to city council, to the newspapers, to anybody who would listen. But they weren't actually asking what that story was. They were simply speaking on behalf of an entire group of people without engaging with those people at all. So when you recognize that there is an unheard voice, that there's an untapped story, it's engaging in that work of asking questions and listening to the answer that you're given, not making assumptions, but actually participating in that process of saying, I want to know more, I need to know more, and what can I do? From that point, then you're stepping into the place of actually engaging, whether you're going to be an ally, an accomplice, an advocate, or something completely different. You're finding out, how can I actually engage in this work? I see a question here that I will come to right after this last point here, because it's a great question. So I'll come to you in just a second. The final point here is just recognizing that what we're doing for one, we are doing for all. That's part of the story that the Live Black Experience Project has been sharing with the broader community. That simply because it's called the Live Black Experience does not mean that it is only for the Black community. We believe, and it's a historical belief within the Black community in America, that when we elevate our voices, who are among the least heard and the least engaged in our community, everyone gets to take a step up. Everyone and every community gets made better. So when we're acting for the Black community of Flagstaff, we are working for Flagstaff. We say during Black History Month that the story of Black America is the story of America. What that means is that they are not separate stories. They have to work together and they have to be together to advance beautiful community for all of us. We're all part of our own unique and collective stories. We're all telling our own story. We're all living the story of our communities. Each of you who are part of the CCC campus are living your story. You're living the story of each and every classroom you walk into. You're living the story of the broader CCC community. You're living the story of CCC and Flagstaff. You're living the story of Flagstaff and wherever you came from and wherever you go next. All of those stories are working together and building upon each other to something beautiful for everyone who engages with you and becomes part of that story alongside you. By uplifting the voices of unheard people within our community, we're leading to that work of collective understanding, of having a better understanding of who we are as individuals and who we are together. The call is for us to speak with, not to speak over. You're speaking alongside, not on behalf of, unless you've been given permission, but that work is really focusing on ensuring that you're not taking over the narrative of somebody else whose story needs to be heard. At the same time, you're adding your own voice to that narrative, recognizing that I have a story to tell as well. Each of you has a story to tell as well. And when we hear all of those stories collectively, then we're building a better and a stronger, more beautiful community for all of us collectively. So to go back to the question that was asked, someone asked if I could elaborate on the distinction between living in proximity to and not in relationship with a community and what that looks like in daily life. So there is a beautiful graphic that explains the difference between inclusion, integration, segregation, all of those different sorts of terminologies. It's categorized in circles. And when you have a group that is segregated, they might be just on the border of the whole community, but not actually brought into that community and recognized as part of it. So when we talk about living alongside, but not necessarily being included within a community, that means that you're not fully belonging to that community. In daily life, that might look like if you're in a workplace and you're the only person that looks like you, you're certainly part of the team, but is your voice heard? Are the unique aspects of your experience heard within that workplace to let you feel or understand that your voice is actually valued? If you think about it, it's very clear when it comes to ability status. If you think about a team that's wanting to do team building and they decide, let's go play soccer, and you're in a wheelchair, well, I can't play the same way as everybody else can. That's living in proximity to, but not necessarily being fully included within that community. And part of the work that we're looking to do is figure out, how do we avoid those moments? How do I say, instead of doing this activity that's going to maybe unwittingly exclude different voices within the community, how can I plan events? How can I develop policy? How can I build community in a way that brings all of those stories together and lets them all engage in equal and equitable ways within that community? So thank you all for joining and for listening to this presentation. I am happy to take any further questions that folks may have and just engage with you as we move forward and think about, what does it look like to be part of community? What does it look like to advance community? And how are we all part of the story that is Flagstaff and that is the communities that we call home? So thank you.
It looks like we do have a question that's popped up. I don't know if you want to read it or if you want me to read it.
I'm just reading through the question. Let me read it out loud. So the question is, there is concern over deliberate work to remove BIPOC history and lived experiences in education. Do you foresee legal pathways to strike down efforts and laws that quell the telling of history in schools? That's a great question. And it's a powerful question. It's a hard question, but it's also a very important question. One thing that we're seeing more and more now is this movement advanced by fear. The fear of having to confront uncomfortable stories in our histories and within our communities. And the response to that fear has often been, and increasingly so, the attempts to just pretend those stories don't exist and actually write laws that say, we're not going to talk about that because it's going to make the wrong people feel uncomfortable. The response to that, I think, is both legislative, acknowledging that that's not the right way for us to confront our history, that we cannot avoid repeating those same mistakes in our past if we're not even willing to acknowledge that they happened in the first place. But I think it's also personal. One of the complicated aspects of conversations about critical race theory or different things like that is coming to a true understanding of what that even is, what it means. So often when we're seeing these bills that are coming forward that are banning the teaching of critical race theory in elementary schools or high schools, the very first response to that should always be, critical race theory is not taught in elementary schools or high schools. It is a legal framework that is taught in graduate school or law school. So we're using the wrong terminology to begin with. Now, if your argument is actually that we should not be telling the story of the Tulsas of our community, the indigenous schools throughout the United States and Canada, because it's too hard, it's too uncomfortable, it makes us feel bad about ourselves. I think that would be a lot harder for people to actually have to stand up and say in the courtrooms, in school administrative offices, to acknowledge that that's truly what we're saying here. This is too hard for us to have to talk about, so we don't want you to talk about it at all. Now, where do we each come into that individually? Where we each come into that individually is being willing to say, this is hard to talk about, but I'm going to do it anyway. I want to know this history. I want to hear this story that was never taught to me in school, that was never talked about anywhere before, but I heard a whisper of it. I want to know what the truth is here, and I want to know how it impacted history going forward. The more that we are willing to engage in those uncomfortable and difficult, but brave and bold conversations, the better we're going to be collectively as society. And that applies across so many ranges of conversations that we can be having. It's not just about race. It's not just about gender. It's about all the different things where we find ourselves in any form of conflict, whether it's ideological, philosophical. You can't come to a place of consensus or understanding unless you're willing to engage in the conversation. So what each of us can do is simply be willing to engage in the conversation, ask questions, and then stop to actually listen to the answers that are given to you. It's also understanding that none of those experiences that you're hearing, none of those stories that you're hearing in response to the questions that you're asking are what we call monolithic. And for anyone who doesn't know, that simply means that my story is not the same as Megan's story. Even though we're both women, our experiences as women might be very different. If I'm talking to my brother, we're both Black, but he's a boy. I'm a girl. He is taller than I am. He does different work. He's had different experiences than I have had. He lives in Pennsylvania. I live in Arizona. We have vastly different experiences, even though we grew up in the same household for over 30 years. So it's understanding that no one story is going to give you the full picture. So seek out different stories to come to a broader understanding of your world and see how that changes you and your perspectives and your understanding of that world going forward.
We've got some good questions on here.
The next one I'm seeing is, how can organizations that are actively seeking to improve their diversity, equity, and inclusion partner to reach populations that don't have a voice and recruit or empower them to take on leadership roles? Again, great question. I think part of that is understanding that you need to be engaged within the community. And that means actively going out and seeking out those stories. I acknowledge that in a time like we're living in now, it becomes even harder to do that. When many folks are still working or living in isolation or quarantines or just not as comfortable being out in social spaces. But I think one thing that this period of COVID and the pandemic have really gifted us with is virtual formats. Knowing that I can go onto Facebook or onto Eventbrite and look up different groups or organizations within Flagstaff or within other communities that are talking about important stories that I might not have known about. I can hear someone talking on a Facebook Live session about an issue that they're experiencing within our community. And I can then go out and seek other people who I know personally or organizations that are addressing that issue and start asking that question of, what's going on here? What am I missing? What have I not seen that's happening within my community? And how can I be proactively part of working for this? Can I be an advocate? Can I ally with you to try and push for change or to get this story out into the community more broadly? Can I be an accomplice with you? I think most of us have heard at this point the famous John Lewis quote of calling for good trouble. How can I create good trouble within the community? Is it going before city council and saying, I've heard the story and you need to hear it too? Or is it going to your boss or to your coworkers and saying, hey, this is something that's going on within the community. How does that impact what we're doing? And how can we make sure that the impact that we're having within the community is positive? So it's asking questions, seeking out those stories, and just being willing to listen and hear and learn. The next question is, a common rebuttal to efforts for recognition of marginalized communities is that if we recognize one, we will have to recognize any and all groups which come forward to demand recognition, and that will devalue the act of recognition itself. How do we as allies respond to this challenge? That's a very good question. Again, the person who's asking this, I would really love to chat with you offline because you are asking just amazing questions tonight. So my thinking on this question is kind of twofold, because I think there's often the challenge within truly marginalized communities. So if we're talking about like different racial or ethnic identities or groups, often what happens is the presentation that, well, I would love to support the work of the Black community, but you know what, the Hispanic community has been asking for this, so I give it to you if I could, but the Hispanic group came first, so they're going to get it. And it creates that friction between where it's kind of a distraction tactic to say, I can't get what my community needs because this other community is asking for it too. If we really sat back and thought about it, what our response to those moments should be is, why can't we all have a piece of the same pie? We're asking for the same things. That tells you that there is work that needs to be done in all of these communities. And you know what? I'm going to stand with my Indigenous brothers, sisters, and neighbors. I'm going to stand with this Hispanic organization, this Asian group, this group that's fighting for ADA rights, the LGBTQ plus community. I'm going to stand alongside everyone to fight for things that are going to make the world better for everyone. Now, the other side of that argument is often the fear that if we say that every voice should be heard, then how do we combat the idea that, well, that means that anti-Semitic voices should be heard. That means that if I'm fighting for pro-choice causes, well, then you need to listen to this other voice instead as well, or alongside that. They carry equal weight. And I think that's where we start to get very complicated. I think part of that work is being willing to engage in those bold conversations. Not to say that every voice that's going to come into the conversation has equal validity, for lack of a better word, but to say that I am willing to at least ask, where is this perspective coming from? What makes you say this? What am I not seeing in your story that tells me why you came to believe this? I might not ultimately agree with whatever someone says. I've had very interesting conversations recently in the DEI realm, where in a few of those conversations, I've had it shared with me that the perspective was, you know, if racism would stop existing, and this is almost a quote from a couple of these conversations, racism would stop existing if Black people would stop talking about racism. Well, I pretty strongly disagree with that, but my question in response to it is not, what's wrong with you? My question in response to that is, what makes you think that? What experience did you have that leads you to think that that's true? I want to understand that so I can better understand both how to respond and so I can better understand even if I'm not going to change the conversation with this person, I now have that as another tool in my toolkit to know, like, this is some of the perspective that I'm battling against here. This is some of the pushback that I need to be able to have an answer for, or to be able to acknowledge exists, to advance this conversation further. So it's not thinking that I'm going to change everyone's mind. It's not thinking that I'm going to fix every perspective that I think is wrong or I disagree with, but it's knowing that my broader understanding of the conversation makes my conversation better. It makes the conversation better for the next person that I have that conversation with. And it leads us to at least further understandings of each other, if not total agreement. So the next question I see here is there some story about the experiences or history of BIPOCs of or from the Flagstaff area that really surprised or moved you on your journey of awareness and learning? Oh, that's a really good question. There have just been so many different stories that have come. Well, one thing that I will say is that so many of these stories are new to me because I'm relatively newer to Flagstaff. I've been here for, oh goodness, I think 11 or more years now. But I think if you were not born here, then you're always kind of new here. So even if I have been here for 30 years, there's going to be a story that's completely brand new to me. I think one thing that's been particularly moving for me in hearing different stories, whether it's from the Live Black experience work or working with Flagstaff Shelter Services and those who are experiencing homelessness. I work with NAMI Flagstaff, and so hearing stories of people that are experiencing mental and behavioral health concerns, or partnering with Indigenous organizations and hearing some of their stories. I think the thing that stands out to me, and that is the most impactful for me, is the number of times people will say something along the lines of, I've been saying this for years, but nobody is listening. The fact that we have all these different groups within our community who we have organizations that are meant to be working for them and are working for them. And please don't mishear me here. All of these different groups and all of the conversations are advancing the work to contribute to all of these different identity groups in very meaningful and beneficial ways. But when you have someone who, in the midst of all of those things, still feels unseen or unheard, for whatever reason, that just hits me right here. And it tells me that no matter how far we come, we still have a lot further that we can go. And I say that not being a fan of the phrase, we still have a long way to go. I feel like that often gets said just to avoid acknowledging that, sure, there's still a long road ahead, but you also still have to take that next step forward. But I say that now to just say that no matter how far we get, there is always going to be someone who does not feel like they've been brought along on that journey. And the question becomes, how do I help bring them to the place where they feel like they are being heard, where they feel like they do belong as part of this community and can be part of the story that's being told? So great question. And certainly you're going to have me thinking about that one for the rest of the night, just some of the different stories and experiences. The next question is, how do we skirt the issue of wanting to ask questions and listen to a specific group or group member while not requiring them to be in constant education mode? That is a phenomenal question, because I think it's something that we need to remember when we're engaging in advocacy and wanting to be allies with different groups, is that it is not actually the work of the marginalized to educate you on their experience. Now, certainly you should seek out the stories of people who are living that experience, but it's always an invitation, not a demand. I might go to someone who is of a different identity group than my own and say, you know, I've been hearing a lot about this and I'm really curious. Are you willing to talk to me about this? And I need to be willing to accept if their answer is yes or if their answer is no. I need to understand and acknowledge that there may become, or we might reach a point in the conversation where they say, you know what, I don't really want to talk about that, but here's a book that you can read. But part of that work and engaging in that is me going out and being willing to do some of that work myself. Because the more that we start relying on those folks to be the ones that are telling us the full story of what it means to be part of that group, the more emotional burden that we're putting on them. And you reach the point where you're no longer educating yourself as much as you are creating potential harm for the person that you're hoping will answer all those questions for you. So be willing to ask the question, but also be willing to be told no, or I can't engage with you on that, or I would rather you look this up. Don't take it personally if someone comes back to you and says, let me Google that for you, or just sends you that link. That may be them gently or not so gently telling you, I don't have the capacity to be your teacher here, but here are still some resources where you can learn it without putting that burden on me or somebody else. The next question is, over the last 4 years, many marginalized groups have become more visible and vocal regarding their priorities for survival. In this environment of seemingly competing priorities, how do allies avoid fatigue and determine the most effective course of relevant action? Again, beautiful question. Part of that work, I think, is recognizing that we are stronger together than we are independently, that I cannot be the sole voice that's speaking for my community. And if it's getting to the point that I'm feeling like I'm the only one out here who's talking about this or focusing on this, then A, it's okay if I need to take a break. B, it's okay if I go to someone and say, I need help with this. Are you willing to come alongside and work with me? And C, if I've experienced that, then I know somebody else is experiencing that too. And if I have the emotional if I have the emotional capacity at the time to say to somebody else who is fighting for their story to be heard, hey, I see you might be struggling with this right now. A, are you okay? B, how can I help? Being willing to partner and come alongside each other. I think that's one thing that we often miss in these conversations is, again, so often with the Live Black Experience Project, we are having to emphasize and re-emphasize, share and reshare over and over again that this is not just for the Black community of Flagstaff. Even though we're saying that we want our story to be heard and we want to be seen within this community, we're also saying that I recognize that if you're willing to help tell this story, then we're going to elevate the entire community. What we're doing for one, we're doing for all. So we are willing to partner and share and collaborate and do all of those things that help us to work in this process together. So being willing to partner, being willing to pause when you need to in that work and say, I don't have to go this alone. And if I don't have the capacity right now, then I can share that work with somebody else. I want to be mindful of time. So I see we have 2 more questions here and I'm happy to cover them both, but I just want to check with Megan quickly if.
Oh no, you go right ahead. If anybody needs to log off, you're welcome to. We are recording this right now, so we will We'll share the recording with everybody afterwards, and I'll make sure that all of our resources are shared with the group. So if you do have to log on, thank you for joining us. And otherwise, yeah, Kara, if you're comfortable answering a couple more questions, we'd love to have you carry on. I'm just enamored by everything you have to say. So we appreciate your time so much.
Sure. The next question here is, how do you convince people this is a conversation we need to talk about when they believe nothing is wrong with how things are now? Again, wonderful question. And I think this is where we start to see the importance of engaging in conversations. There are several books actually now that talk about the importance of having difficult conversations or bold conversations or courageous conversations. There are different terms for it, but it's basically that moment that someone comes to you and says something like that. It's actually a crack in a doorway that you can slip your foot into, and whether they realize it or not, you almost, I don't want to say trick them into having the conversation, but you find that wiggle room where you can get your foot in the door and let them see your experience of the situation is not the full experience of the situation. If someone comes to me and says that I don't see a problem here, or I've never experienced this, my response is, if I have experienced it, let me tell you about a time that I've experienced this. Or I might ask that question of, well, who have you talked to about this? Are you only talking to people who have had similar experiences to your own? Or are you talking to folks who are telling you that they have had this experience, or that they have faced this concern within the community? One of the challenges of engaging in this work is that willingness to hear and believe what somebody else is telling you. If I am telling you that I have a problem, be willing to believe that that problem exists, even if it has not been your experience. And the same goes for if I'm listening to somebody else's experience. I might never have thought about an issue in the way that somebody is presenting it to me before, but the moment that they tell me that, it's an opportunity for me to listen, to believe them, and then to ask, well, what else do I need to know? What have I been missing? What have I not known or understood about your experience that that might, if not change my perspective, at least give me a broader perspective on what this issue is. So it's all that interactive process of actually being willing to listen and truly being willing to hear what other people are sharing. The next question here is, over the last decade, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have become increasingly popular and now dominate professional, academic, and social spaces as a method of redressing discrimination issues within organizations. However, inclusion does not always translate to belonging, as there is always a power group doing the including. In organizational settings, how should marginalized and allied participants respond to power groups that refuse to go beyond the safety of inclusion and empower minorities to belong? So this is a conversation that I've been engaging with a couple different groups in terms of, there's a quote that often gets brought up in DEI conversation that says, diversity is, it's something like, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And it's a good quote for the beginning part of some of these conversations, but it starts to fall apart as a metaphor as you start thinking about, well, if I am someone who cannot stand, let's say, and I'm just using this as an example, it is not true, but let's say I can't stand country music, and you invite me to a dance that is nothing but country music, and then you invite me to dance. Well, I don't want to dance. I'm not actually, I don't belong here. You've included me, sure, but I don't feel a sense of belonging because you didn't bother to invite me to something where I could actually be enjoying this experience. And that's so often what happens in organizational or company settings when it comes to inclusion and belonging conversations, is we don't hit that gap between what it means to be included, but also to be included with equity and to be included as part of a diverse group. You have to have all three of those things working together for there to truly be that sense of belonging, which is the marriage of all three of those aspects together when they all are working in tandem. So when it comes to how to respond to those power groups that are refusing to move beyond that safety point of inclusion, I think part of it is both recognizing finding the champion within that organization, and particularly within the power structure that is actually willing to hear that. And recognizing that there's not always going to be one. And that's just kind of the hard truth of it. I think part of then what the work becomes when there's not a champion for true belonging within the organization is finding ways to create a space of belonging for yourselves. Often that looks like affinity groups within an organization where you say, you know what, the company isn't going to talk about this, but we are having similar experiences and we need an outlet to talk about it. So maybe our affinity is this particular identity, but we also are all big fans of brunch. We're going to form a brunch affinity group where we happen to talk about this and where we can get this out in a place that is safe for us to engage in the conversation, where we are able to empower ourselves and we get that sense of belonging within this group, if not within the broader company. It's not an entirely satisfactory or satisfying answer, but sometimes we have to work in that space that we have until the room opens up for there to be a true champion for that change within the organization's power structure. And that's really what a lot of this work comes down to, is true diversity, equity, and inclusion work is being willing to engage in the sharing and equitable distribution of power. And if that willingness does not exist, then you keep working where you can until you get to a place where someone is willing to break that chain. And that history of not being willing to engage in it. It's a slow moving process. It's why we say that even though people refer to DEI work as a marathon, it's a marathon without a finish line. And it's always going to keep going. And you have to take care of yourself and take care of the people who are along with you on that journey so that you're not faltering before you reach the next milestone on that journey.
I think we might have hit the finish line. Kara, thank you so much for giving us your time tonight, for taking the time to provide some education for all of us. I truly appreciate that you've put this much effort into such a beautiful message. It's just, I have so much to think about, and truly I feel like I'm more prepared to prepare my table for people to sit with me in a way that I don't think I would have considered before. So we appreciate your time so much, and I hope everybody had a wonderful experience tonight. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we sign off?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, well, a couple of only things that I will add is just a reminder that despite being part of the work with the Live Black Experience Project, I do want it to be understood that I am still myself new to engaging in this story. So please take the extra time to go out into the community and find out some of these stories for yourselves. Go to the Southside Community Association's website, which is, I believe, southsideflagstaff.org. or .org, where they share a lot of the story of the Southside community. Go and talk to folks that have been here for generations of their family, or at least longer than my small 10 years. I know it sounds long to some of us, but I promise you there is so much more that exists in the story beyond what even I'm aware of. Know that I don't have the full stories of some of the groups and organizations and the histories of different neighborhoods and communities and locations throughout our city. But there are people out there who do have broader stories, and it's so important to engage with them. Again, visit the Live Black Experience YouTube channel, go back and rewatch, especially going back to the early sessions where the focus very much was on the Flagstaff community. We've broadened and we're talking more about national concerns and broader historical questions. But a lot of the conversations early and throughout the conversations that we've had are talking about some of that Flagstaff history. On the Southside Community Association website, there's recordings of almost all of those town halls that we had, where you can hear for yourself some of those conversations as well. If you go into the document and read the Live Black Experience strategic plan, there's an entire section of that plan. And I warn you now, it's something like 94 or 96 pages, but there's a full section that captures some of the notes from that question of what was it like to live in Flagstaff, what has changed over time, and you see some of those stories recorded there. So where you can, go out and get those stories and engage with those stories further. And never stop asking questions. I think that's the big thing, is never stop engaging in the conversation, never stop asking those questions and being a participatory member of your community.
Well, I don't think I can follow up with anything better than that. Thank you all for sticking with us. I think it was well worth it. And we're going to go ahead and sign off. We have another Comet talk coming up next week already, and I'll make sure I include information about that. So be sure to sign up and join us again next Wednesday. Enjoy your snowy night. Everybody stay warm. Thank you again, Kara, and have a great night.